Hi, it's me. Today, we've got a brand new target extraction for Limbus Company featuring 2 new pieces of equipment for Season 0, meaning you can get them whenever you want. Firstly, we have Devyat Association North Section 3 Sinclair, a powerful new identity for the Rupture archetype. Then, we also have Asymmetrical Inertia Heathcliff, a new E.G.O that slots nicely into the Tremor archetype. Neither are particularly complicated, so we'll just jump right into it. To start off, Sinclair's defense skill, a 9-16 rolling blunt gluttony counter with 1 coin, functions exactly the same as Rodian's. Unfortunately, retreat is still not a particularly practical mechanic, so the best I can say is don't use it unless Sinclair is literally about to die. Courier Trunk Decay Hammer is a 3-11 rolling blunt lust skill with 2 coins that can become a 3-15 with enough Courier Trunk or enemy Rupture. This skill can inflict 3 Rupture count if you have enough Courier Trunk. In fact, this ID in general inflicts a lot more Rupture count than most other IDs in the game. The catch is that instead of not consuming Rupture count once the Rupture threshold of 15 potency and 3 count is met, you instead inflict some defense level down. While this isn't exactly what Rupture wants, he inflicts enough count otherwise to slingshot your Rupture stacking without much outside help. Courier Trunk Demolition Gadget is a 4-16 rolling blunt gluttony skill with 3 coins that can become a 4-22 with enough Courier Trunk or enemy Rupture. On top of Courier Trunk increasing his speed, this skill also gives haste for free, and this Sinclair pretty easily outspeeds the majority of other IDs by turn 3. The skill itself also inflicts way more Rupture overall than the majority of skills once you have 15 or more Courier Trunk on Sinclair. Polidnitsa I Trust You is a 5-17 rolling blunt wrath skill with 3 coins that can become a 5-23, well technically a 5-26, with enough Courier Trunk or enemy Rupture. Additionally, this skill gains a massive damage boost if the enemy has 15 or more Rupture, even if they don't have enough Rupture count, meaning the sweet spot for this ID is if the enemy has 15 potency but only 2 count. This goes doubly so because the first coin can inflict up to 4 Rupture count. Plus, the last coin giving 2 haste makes the skill always useful. If you trigger the full Rupture conditional, the final coin of the skill gains 4 power, which is, fine, but not ultimately too big of a damage increase. Compared to Rodian being able to reroll the last coin, this is pretty underwhelming, but the ID comes together quite well and is a very solid blunt damage dealer both in and out of a Rupture setup. His passive is the same as Rodian's, giving him a bit of shield for free based on how much Courier Trunk he has, which does a lot to help with his survivability, especially since he'll start to self-destruct in longer battles thanks to Courier Trunk. His support passive is also pretty nice in Rupture teams, inflicting up to 1 Fragile's worth of defense level down if the target has Rupture, and while not as strong as Talisman, it's still quite good for most teams if you don't have Talisman available. His unique combination of Sin affinities also perfectly fuel 3 of his own E.G.O, being Branch of Knowledge, Impending Day, and Lifetime Stew. Now, I would never recommend using Lifetime Stew, but the other 2 are decent enough to be considered, especially with how much Rupture potency Branch of Knowledge can actually inflict when it's used properly. The optimal team members for this Sinclair aren't going to be much different from any other Rupture team. To start, either one of Cinq-Merceau or Devyat Rodian can be brought with since Sinclair's count infliction is so absurdly high. Even once he starts chewing away Rupture count when his conditionals get fulfilled, he will always inflict enough to make up for it on the next turn. 7 Faust, 7 Heathcliff, and 7 Otis always work in a Rupture team due to their high count infliction. The addition of Lasso also makes Faust an even better choice due to how strong it gets under Gluttony Resonance. Lantern Dawn is never not going to be a great unit for Rupture if you happen to have her. W Corp Yusang works really well with this Sinclair, both because he can inflict a good amount of Rupture, and because the amount of Rupture this Sinclair can contribute can make Dimension Shredder deal a ton of extra damage in single target boss fights. And lastly, his Sin affinities work strangely well in a burn setup. While Dawn Office or N Corp are probably better, his strange combination of Sin affinities and E.G.O can be used pretty effectively in a burn team, but you'll need another ID to help generate Envy and Gloom resources if you do end up bringing him. Asymmetrical Inertia Heathcliff is a brand new E.G.O for the Tremor archetype, and I've been seeing a lot of people automatically dismissing it for some reason, if only because it doesn't inflict Tremor reverb. As a reminder, when Tremor Decay was first introduced, it immediately made Tremor way more viable of a choice for most difficult content, especially Refraction Railway 3. This E.G.O is actually the first that introduces a Tremor type that applies to the self in Tremor Clockwinding, at least that can be obtained by the player. Clockwinding increases Heathcliff's max speed by 2, and allows him to inflict one additional tremor potency or count when inflicting tremor to enemies by consuming one of his own tremor count. More tremor infliction is always nice, and since Heathcliff has no other reason to have tremor count on himself, his tremor IDs are always going to want to have this as an option. Asymmetrical Inertia is a 8 to 24 rolling blunt sloth ego with 2 coins and 3 attack weight, and currently is Heathcliff's only source of self-tremor, granting as much as 8 from a single use. You only actually gain tremor clockwinding on using this ego if your highest resonance is sloth, but since this is a tremor ego and also inflicts tremor on its own, that shouldn't be too much of a challenge. The first hit inflicts either a good amount of tremor potency or count depending on the coin result. Then, the second coin bursts tremor and inflicts sloth fragility when successful. Again, very valuable in tremor. Additionally, it inflicts more sloth fragility next turn with 3 or more sloth resonance if it's your highest resonance. On its own, this is a really solid ego, dealing a lot of damage, the most damage out of all of his ego except for binds, while also increasing your sloth damage for the rest of the turn. However, if that combined with the fact that it's really easily fueled in tremor doesn't convince you, there is more to it. The passive of this ego makes it so that whenever an enemy has its tremor burst, they are inflicted with 1 fragile. It triggers up to once per enemy as well. This isn't sloth fragility, it's general fragile, which increases the damage of all skills. This makes this ego incredibly useful in tremor even if you are focusing on using tremor reverb, because it's essentially 10% free damage, but it also opens an avenue to build your tremor team around raw damage instead, which can be more effective in a lot of situations. It should be noted that in English, the description is messed up. It caps at 1 fragile per enemy every turn, but it's true that any ally can trigger the tremor burst to inflict it. The Corrosion is a 28 to 12 rolling blunt sloth ego with 2 coins and 3 attack weight. There isn't much to say about this that hasn't already been said, as it basically just inflicts more of everything. 2 more potential self-tremor, up to 2 more tremor count or 1 more tremor potency with the first hit, with 1 additional tremor count guaranteed, and double the sloth fragility infliction. This is where it's important to note that the Corrosion of an ego activates the passive for the current turn and not the next turn. That's 1 fragile and 2 sloth fragility for each target, plus 2 sloth fragility next turn if you use this Corrosion. While overclocks aren't usually practical, this one is fairly cheap, and if Heathcliff is the fastest unit, you can make your team's damage go up by quite a lot. However, it would only be worth doing it this way if you haven't already used the ego once during the encounter before, because this way you get to take advantage of the fragile early. No Heathcliff perfectly fuels this ego, however both Ophi Heathcliff and Sunshower Heathcliff fuel 3 out of 4 required sin affinities. I would never recommend Sunshower, so Ophi Heathcliff is definitely the best user of this ego until Heath gets another tremor ID. His ability to inflict tremor decay, which is still very viable by the way, helps the team's raw damage by a very significant amount, since it can lower the enemy defense level by quite a lot. His only major downside is not having the ability to burst tremor without being at uptime 4, but the ego being able to burst tremor on demand covers that weakness pretty solidly. This ego fits best in a tremor team, unsurprisingly. The usual suspects for a tremor reverb team actually still work perfectly fine, like your Devyat Lu and T-Corp Don Quixote, since they're both still very strong IDs overall, and I'd still recommend bringing your Devyat Lu in this team anyways. However, since this ego lends well to a damage-focused tremor setup, there are a couple less conventional options to consider. While Regret Faust isn't going to surprise anybody, Rose Spanner Rodian might be one you wouldn't expect me to recommend. Envy Generation isn't something that tremor teams excel at, and while she doesn't have a sloth skill, she does have a very powerful damage-dealing skill too that fits very well into this type of setup. And if you really want more Envy, then T-Corp Rodian is not a terrible choice either. Uradivi Ryoshu and Molar Otis both do really well as damage dealers for a tremor team, and while you may think that having Ryoshu on the bench is better, and it can be, her extra hit against staggered targets can add up to a lot if they have enough fragile, plus it also inflicts 1 more fragile due to it bursting tremor if that enemy hasn't already had their tremor burst this turn. Rose Spanner Merceau is not the greatest ID in the world, but he's not the worst option in a tremor team due to his high potency infliction and incredibly good sin affinities. And while you don't want him in an active slot, Molar Yi Sang's support passive inflicting a bunch of defense level down is going to be noticeable for dealing even more raw damage with your team. And that's about all I have to say about this new target extraction. Thanks for watching, I hope you found this helpful, and I'd appreciate if you leave a like if you enjoyed it. I have both of the new equipments in my company if you'd like to use them. I have all of E.G.O at Threadspin 4, but it should hopefully be enough for everybody regardless. I'm down to double digits of yellow crates at this point, if I'm being honest. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you again soon.